Hi, my name is Steve Zeiger. Over the past several years, we've been asked to educate members of NAPAC, the National Association of Estate Planners and Counsels, STEP, the Society of Trust and Estate Practitioners, over 30 local estate planning councils, over 10 FPAs, the Practicing Law Institute, the CFA Society, and we've been speaking about the fiduciary era for life insurance. We've had so many requests for the presentation, we decided to put together an educational video so you can have a copy of the presentation and you can have our verbiage in the background. And now's actually the perfect time to educate fiduciaries on the proper decision support material for life insurance, because on October 20th, 2022, the New York State Court of Appeals constitutionally affirmed Regulation 187, the nation's first client's best interest regulation. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. If you have a question, you can email me. My telephone number is on the screen. If you'd like a copy of our Trust and Estates article, simply send me an email. We're happy to send it to you. And if you'd like a research report at no cost, again, simply email us or call me on my phone. It doesn't mean we're doing business together. If you have a request, it simply means you'd like to learn more. So now we're going to talk about guidance from New York State Department of Financial Services, FINRA, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the Society of Actuaries, the CFP Practice Standard, the Uniform Prudent Investor Act, and Morningstar. So first, let's talk about Regulation 187. Regulation 187 is the nation's first client's best interest regulation, and it uses fiduciary wording: care, skill, prudence, and diligence of a prudent person, looking at cost, performance, and risk. Who does it apply to? It applies to residents of New York, even if the advisors are in another state. It applies to former residents of New York if the ILET is domiciled in New York. It applies to ILET trustees who are in New York, even if the ILET is domiciled elsewhere, and it applies when the financial services advisor is in New York. So ethically, Regulation 187 applies in every state. It requires considering only the interests of the consumer in making a recommendation. It must reflect the care, skill, prudence, and diligence of a prudent person. And the advisor must prominently disclose in writing any limitations in the ranges of the policies that they offer. Meaning if they're an agent of one particular insurance company and they can only present from that insurance company, they need to disclose that to the client. Let's talk about why Regulation 187, why it ethically applies in every state. So imagine that we have an attorney, an accountant, an RIA, a trustee in the state of Arizona, and they have an insurance matter, and they speak to an insurance advisor in the state of Arizona. That individual has no requirement to work in the client's best interest. Therefore, the attorney, the CPA, the RIA, the trustee, they should either A, contact an insurance advisor in the state of New York who complies with Regulation 187, or they should simply give a list of the requirements to the agent in Arizona and have them work under a client's best interest formula. Let's talk about guidance from the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. And I think the National Association of Insurance Commissioners are kind of a funny organization if you look at what they say. So in 1995, their goals were to ensure that illustrations do not mislead purchasers of insurance. 20 years later, in 2015, they noticed a lack of uniform practice resulting in illustrations that use an apparently identical crediting rate, yet illustrate different rates. So 20 years later, insurance illustrations are still misleading. Let's talk about what FINRA has to say. So in FINRA Rule 2210D, comparisons must disclose all investment objectives, the costs and expenses, because not doing so would be misleading. So what typically happens when I speak to an insurance agent, they say, well, if I'm presenting a universal life or a whole life or indexed universal life, that doesn't fall under FINRA Rule 2210. And I say that's actually correct. However, by not disclosing the investment objectives, the costs and expenses, it's still a misleading presentation, even though it doesn't fall under that FINRA rule. FINRA Rule 2210-2C, it's inappropriate to compare an insurance policy with any other product based on hypothetical performance. Yet, most of you probably have seen presentations where it's an Excel spreadsheet of two policies side by side. That's really forbidden. Let's talk about the Society of Actuaries, the final report on the task force on life insurance, and they say illustration should not be used for comparison purposes because doing so is fundamentally inappropriate. So in several slides, I'll show you how to benchmark life insurance so you're not comparing the illustrations side by side. The Department of the Treasury, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, they oversee bank trust companies, and they say the illustrations have a high degree of fluctuation. And what that really means is they're just unreliable. The Uniform Prudent Investor Act has two requirements that I'd like to speak about today. The first one is a duty to diversify. So periodically, we see an individual that has $10 million, $50 million, $100 million of coverage with one insurer. And they would probably never buy a $100 million bond from one issuer. They would want to diversify. And the same thing is true for life insurance. There's a duty to diversify unless it's prohibitively expensive to do so. Now let's talk about what the Uniform Prudent Investor Act says about costs. A trustee may only incur costs that are appropriate and reasonable in relationship to the asset. And here the asset is life insurance, and the associated costs are the cost of insurance charge, the policy expense, a premium load, and perhaps a cash value-based wrap fee for variable products. Let's talk about the Center for Economic Justice. And I'm going to read the quote. The current illustration regime permits insurers to illustrate investments in ways not permitted for any other type of investment, a faulty infrastructure that consistently produces misleading information to consumers. So we're hearing this word misleading kind of often.